Right, transport after COVID. Well, traffic is back to something like 95%, road traffic is back to something like 95% of pre-COVID levels. As you can see from this picture, the RAC van is trying to determine which lane to be in. And government policy claims to be getting the country back on its feet. So here's an example of someone getting back on their feet in Oslo, crossing the tram tracks. A theme I should follow. So, we are still very dependent on cars. And interestingly, the UK tram propaganda film, if you want a better name, didn't mention that trams actually attract people out of cars, specifically. Now, Danny Bourne did say people have stopped buying new cars, and if we look at Croydon, tram link there, something like 25% of the passengers have left their car behind and used tram instead. And Andrew's covered most of these. I just want to pick out one. In spite of the thrust towards electrification, we are still 99% dependent on oil for our transport system. It's the highest dependence. If you look at all the oil used in Britain, about 80% of it now goes into transport. It used to be about 30%, where we had industrial uses of oil for heating and for processing and for building and heating and so on. All of that's changed. And the final one, and again Andrew picked this up in terms of comparing Freiburg with York, is the very low level of public transport trips. Nationally it's 7%. Even in London it's only 15% across the whole city for bus use. If you add on the tube it comes up to about 22%, because the tube network is concentrated primarily in the city centre. So this is where we were before COVID, cars everywhere. Some of you are old enough to remember Max Bygraves. Things ain't what they used to be. They used to be trams, not very quick, got you from place to place. And now they're just jams, half a mile thick, saying the human race is walking. Well, I can remember as a 5-year-old being taken in April 1952 on the last tram Sunday through the Kingsway subway. And 2 months later, in July, the whole tram network was closed in London. And 6 months after that, London suffered the worst air pollution disaster that world's ever experienced, great smog. And I can vividly remember that because I had a week off school. And unfortunately, this is what many people who are car addicts see as public transport. A rather utilitarian vehicle. This is a top deck of an RC, I think. Thus, thank you very much for that confirmation. Because most people who drive cars have never been on a bus. Right, well, during COVID, as we all know, travel slumped very badly, particularly after the Prime Minister told us not to use public transport, which rather belayed his bring back buses better, or whatever the right jargon is. And of course, that meant all the public transport operators were in danger of going bust. And they had to be bailed out by the government big time. I can't remember what the total figure is, but it's like getting over £10 billion. You take rail, bus and tram services. So this is a picture from a large part of the country during COVID. An elderly couple walking down an empty street. You all that experience? I can remember when my street, which is a bus route in Liverpool, not a car in sight. After COVID, well, car use is now back to 95%, which is what I've started with. Trains are back to 30%, buses 40%, the tube is 50%, and we have this frantic efforts to electrify cars. Again, some of you may be old enough to remember in the 1970s, there was a six-day war and in the Middle East, and one of the consequences of that is the OPEC countries quadrupled the price of oil, and we had this massive deflation in the West. And Ford, amongst others, did a very big research project on electrifying cars in America, and found that they could convert 95% of the car fleet to electric, because that would cover the mileage that most cars do. But in order to produce the lead acid batteries at that time, the car fleet would take more than the lead that was available in the world. And the same applies to lithium batteries we now are hooked on. And in a sense, we have transferring the pollution from our streets to third world countries where poor people are working in appalling conditions to extract lithium from mines. So here's a picture of congestion as it was BC. And in London anyway, we've had this great growth in cycling use, at least in the city centre or the inner area. Unlike Holland, which again Andrew mentioned because of his trip there to Groningen from Amsterdam, bike use is very high because it's never been low. During the war, of course, they didn't have any oil, so they had to go on their bikes. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, there are more bikes than cars in Britain. Most of them are stuck in people's garages, and they think, oh, I'll take the bike out for the weekend. They put it on the roof rack, drive into the countryside, round around a few country lanes, and that's their idea of using bikes. We don't use in this country mostly bikes for transport purposes, what the Dutch call utilitarian riding. One of my other hats is the president of the Merseyside Cycling Campaign. Over tea break I can give you some interesting data on accident rates. Well, getting the country back on its feet, there was a fascinating study of commuters in the States pre-COVID and comparing people who drove all the way to work to those who parked and rode, and found that the ones who parked and rode were significantly healthier and fitter than the ones that drove all the way. So even just a 50 or 100 yard walk in the car park, from your car to the tram stop or the train stop, and back again in the evening, was enough exercise to keep you healthy. And we have become too sedentary, a country, made worse by COVID, where we sit at our kitchen table with our laptop computers. And one of the ways in which this has manifested itself is the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods. And by putting up planters to stop people driving through, there's been a hell of a lot of reaction to this, especially in parts of London, because it failed in the first stage, which is consultation. What they didn't explain to people was them driving their cars was killing their own children. So if they drove their cars less, if they walked to the shops which they're presently driving to, which they can do, then they would improve the health of themselves and significantly improve the health of their children. Bus Back Better, Andrew's mentioned that. Well, these are some of the things, headlines in that Bus Back Better report from March this year. I honestly can't see how this is going to be achieved unless the government's also proposing to nationalise the whole bus service, which I don't think is on the cards. I think this is just a bit of government rhetoric to make us feel better. But then I may be just an old cynic. Or a young at heart cynic, whichever way. Thank you, Andrew, for that. Just a joke. We've also had the economy boosting transport plan from May this year, where we're investing 400 million on rail services, excluding HS2, including reopening some reaching lines cut in the 1960s thanks to Ernest Marples, the biggest motorway builder in the world. And we've created out of Network Rail Great British Railways, and we're doing nothing, in my opinion anyway, significantly to change internal modal split in urban areas, which is where most journeys are made, which is where most pollution is, where most of the congestion is. The number of journeys we make long distance is about 3% or less of the total. We make 97% of our journeys in urban areas. That's where we should be focusing, as the French did, with their tramway, nearly a new one every year. So I dug this up, which I thought was rather amusing. Part of an advert for High Speed 2 sort of hung in the air. And as you know, High Speed 2 is not exactly incontroversial, so there's lots of people who like to stop it. And if you're looking at government priorities, £120 billion on High Speed 2, which would benefit maybe 0.5% of the trips between London and Birmingham, when we are suffering from National Health Service severe shortage of new buildings, staff, etc. But again, this is my cynicism. Urban reality. I've mentioned the first two. We have high levels of congestion and pollution still. We are very heavily dependent on cars. And even if we continue making work journeys, working from home, we will still be making more trips to work to catch up. So here's someone working legally at a kitchen table and somebody else working legally at a kitchen table. How would you like working at home? Says the first one. I miss seeing you at Xerox. Isn't that a nice bit of social interaction? Going to work, as well as the economic value of it, has a very important social aspect to it. So many people meet their future spouses at work. It's very difficult to do that, and we know from the various dating apps that they're not very successful and can actually be very negative. People having bad experiences will get distracted from that. I'm going to make a bit of a plug for a book I read over Christmas. It was given to me by my younger son as a Christmas present, called Strong Towns. It's based on work that was done in Portland, and you probably don't know, but Portland was a very run-down port city on the west coast of America until about 30 years ago, when local people got together and said, hey, what can we do? What can we do as local people? A bit like Andrew said about the French. What can we do to turn our economy around? And it starts off with very small things. And if you read around this, you see it's about alleys. Why alleys? Well, they're little neighbourhoods. They don't have any through traffic. People get to know each other, because one of the aspects of neighbourliness is you don't have a wall of traffic in your way. And even in 1963, when Buchanan wrote his seminal report, Traffic in Towns, he identified a threshold of 200 vehicles an hour as the maximum to enable environmentally friendly neighbourhoods to take place, where you could get to know people on the other side of the road. Near the bottom here, flowers, or at the bottom, flowers have no economic value, but what they did in Portland was they started what I call guerrilla gardening. They put in little flower boxes, they grew flowers, they grew vegetables, got people talking together, working together, and that spawned a whole network. Portland has invested in a tramway. Portland is now a very important city on the west coast of America. So, one of the other messages from Strong Towns is that a very large part of the public sector capital programme is actually negative. It reduces the value of the economy, it reduces the wealth creation, because we spend money on capital investment, but we don't spend any money on maintenance. So we have a whole road network full of potholes, because we built new roads or built new motorways, but we have got no money to keep them going. So here's an example of what might be called current thinking. You can see on the right-hand side there's a sort of road which runs through the middle of the shopping centre, and at the bottom and on the left-hand side is a new bypass to the shopping centre being built. When surely it would be better to stop people coming into the centre at all by car. And an example in Nottingham, Andrew and the video said, has had a significant impact on modal split. People have used the tramway in Nottingham and in Manchester and in Sheffield and in Croydon and increasingly in Edinburgh to replace car trips by tram trips. Well, COP26 takes place in November in Glasgow, a nearby city according to Gordon, depending where you start from. We have the UN report which says quite categorically that climate change is here, it's man-made, we need to do something about it. And part of that we need to do something about it is to stop using fossil fuels. And the biggest fossil fuel causing this pollution is coal, which in this country we've almost completely phased out, certainly for electricity production, although there's a bit of a controversy over a new potential mine in Cumbria for coking coal. But oil and gas are the next biggest greenhouse gas emitters. And some friends of mine are into biomethane. Well, we produce a lot of biomethane. It comes out of landfill sites. At the moment, it's just vented into the air. Methane is 8 times more greenhouse effective than carbon dioxide, which comes from burning fossil fuels. We could capture that biomethane that's currently being made and use it constructively. So here's a little table, but the main important message from that at the bottom is, in spite of our efforts, nearly 90% of all the energy we use in this country is still based on fossil fuels. We have a hell of a long way to go. Even if we've got the electricity industry 100% renewable in terms of wave, hydro and solar, all the other sectors would still be dependent on fossil fuels in one way or another. And going back to the States, the Ford study, as I mentioned before, showed that by overnight recharging car batteries, it could use up time in the generating cycle when demand is low overnight. If you look at the demand for electricity, it peaks about 8 o'clock in the morning, then it falls to about 50% during the day, and then it peaks slightly higher in the evening, and overnight it falls to about 10% of the daily average. So there's peak spare capacity there for recharging batteries if we had the metals to do it. Forward to the past, well, until 1900, virtually all public transport in this country was funded and run by private companies. And we could have a long debate about why the public sector became involved. And this still applied to railways until 1948. Buses were only publicly owned totally between 1930 and 1996, when it was privatised. You could argue that the public operation of public transport has only been a blip in the long-term history. And I remember giving a talk to the Municipal Transport Organisation many years ago when there were lots of municipal bus companies, and I had on my graph the rise and fall of different operations, and the first one was in the 17th century stagecoaches, and someone shouted out the back, "I hope you're right, we don't want to get any more stagecoach, do we?" Poor Brian Sousa's got a bad name then. I was in a city where the transport community said, "Oh, it's the duty of the local authority to provide tramways." So I said, "What's more important to your citizens, access to fresh food or having a tramway?" And of course he said, "Access to fresh food." "So, Mr. Transport Chairman, how many supermarkets does your city run?" "None." "So, Mr. Chairman, in your opinion, what will be the consequence of the cities running the city's supermarkets?" And mouthing you without engaging brain, he said, "We'd starve." And I could have a big debate about this, but one of the interesting points we have from our experience that we've not used our money very wisely in public transport in many places. And although Edinburgh is now held up as a success story, it's bankrupted the city in the process. Southend has launched a new transport plan for a tramway this June. Did you know that, Gordon?
I'm glad you're keeping up to date with it.
Oh, right. And of course, Gordon's done the mechanics job, so I'm not going to bait on that. And I've got 2 more slides. I was doing some reading of some historic work on tram transport and how to design for light rail. Well, these are the 5 key steps. Will it work? Is it as simple as possible? Can it be easily maintained? Can it really be built? And does it look well? And this wasn't my thoughts, although I worked using this formula. It was a man called William Ralph Baker, who was addressing the Institute of Locomotive and Carriage Designers in 1938. And this was his seminal vehicle. The Bakerloo line was a tube stop in 1938. As you see, it started in 1938 and continued running until 1988. And then in 1989, some more of the trains were refurbished and sent to the Isle of Wight, and they continued running in the Isle of Wight until January this year. So I think that's a pretty impressive nearly a 90-year lifetime for a vehicle, which shows it will work. It's easy to maintain because it was running. And here's my little baby, 22-ton tram. And here's a very good example, again from London, of something which is simple, easy to design, does it work, can be ready to maintain, the Harry Beck tube map. And this concept of a schematic for public transport network has been followed right around the world. We don't use geographical maps of public transport anymore, so this is why people who get on the tube at Covent Garden to go to Leicester Square could do it faster if they walked. But the tube map as we have it, schematic, shows them almost as far apart as ones between Harrow and Rickmansworth. So, at the moment, would you believe it, second-hand cars are more expensive than new cars. Why? Because you can't buy new cars. And apparently during COVID we have accumulated £250 billion of our own money because we haven't been out and spending it. We haven't gone on foreign holidays, we haven't been going on expensive nights out and so on and so forth. £250 billion is almost the money that Rishi Sunak has borrowed to keep the country afloat. It's £330 billion. So it's sloshing around there in banks, being paid 0.5% or less interest. There's a lot of money that could be mobilised for better public transport if we had schemes that would produce that. Instead we have cars, and I don't know if you follow car adverts, but they've become increasingly surreal. I mean, here's a picture of a BMW on a seashore. How the hell they got it there, I don't know. Because the conjunction between a vehicle, car and road traffic is so horrendous, people wouldn't buy it if they thought the car was going to get them into a traffic jam. And privately funded sustainable transport. One of my students looked at horse tramways in Liverpool and found that the sale of horse manure was almost identical to the profit made by the tramway company. But it was generally sustainable because it was renewable feedstock for the animals, and their output went back to the farmers. When I was a small boy, I remember horses still delivering milk in London, and of course the horses would regularly deposit on the road. And there was a little old lady who went out religiously with her spanner brush and swept it up. And one day I caught her, I said, "What are you doing with that, Mrs.?" She said, "Oh, I'm going to put it on my rhubarb." And I said, "That's funny, we use custard." I seem to have lost the picture somewhere. I need to go back to the last one. I don't know what's happened there.
Yeah. Oh, yes, so it's...
There was one final picture.
Yeah, yeah. Should have...
The last slide.
The white top back there, that's really good.
Next one. Right. Oh, too far.
Like that. Yeah, there. Oh.
Right. So I don't know if you picked up this one. This was in another local paper as a story about the Mechanics project. Very nice, and it had reflections of the wonderful tram stop in Strasbourg that Madame Trautmann had 5 election successes that people said she wouldn't know.